The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Welcome to Squawk Box Europe. I'm Karen Cho with Carolyn Roth. We are live in studio and at Westminster with full coverage of the UK budget all morning. Let's get into your headlines.
It's budget day. After months of speculation, Rachel Reeves is warning of necessary choices as she looks to plug a £30 billion fiscal gap.
The Dow posts its best day since August, while Alphabet shares hit a fresh record on a report that its chips are drawing interest from Meta.
Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky says he's ready to push ahead with a revised peace plan and wants to discuss the more sensitive points in person with President Trump, potentially as soon as this week.
UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves will promise to make fair and necessary choices in today's budget, vowing action to help with living costs, as well as cutting national debt levels. Reeves is expected to announce a series of tax measures to plug a fiscal gap as much as £30 billion, with reports suggesting that could include an extended freeze of tax thresholds, cap tax benefits for pension contributions, and introduce a new tax on high-value homes. Overnight, the government announced a 4.1% increase in the minimum wage as part of its pledge to raise living standards, a move welcomed by union leaders but prompting fresh concerns from businesses, with the UK's hospitality industry body saying companies will have to raise prices. Well, first up, even before we get to the budget, it feels as though the minimum wage issue could be inflationary, and that's been one of the promises, Carolyn, in the budget, that the Chancellor would tackle inflation. So lifting those minimum wages at a time when business already has faced national insurance contributions that have gone up, that is going to put more pressure on business. So mistake number one on budget eve, perhaps. Also, when it comes to the budget today, I've got to say we've been waiting it out. Typically, the autumn statement would come at some point in October, so it has been a nervous wait for a lot of businesses and a lot of residents here in the UK, Carolyn.
A very nervous raid. Good morning to you, Karen. It is Red Box Day. No one does it quite like the British, but in terms of the wait and the lead-in, that has been unnecessarily long. That's what many businesses would argue, because they've slowed down spending, they've slowed down hiring. But just to put this into international context, the UK is facing one of the highest borrowing costs within the G7, and the gap when it comes to the German paper and the French paper, or the yields rather, that has been persistently high ever since that disastrous mini budget by the previous administration, or the one before that, obviously. And bringing that down and reestablishing credibility when it comes to this government, that will be absolutely key. So a lot riding on this. Stakes are very high politically, economically, and fiscally, of course.
And we've seen the sensitivity already in the bond markets over the last number of months. So let's get out to Ian, who has more from the heart of Westminster. Ian, to me it feels like being in the waiting room, waiting for a needle, wondering how much it's going to hurt, if you're going to be left with a sore arm, and at the end of the day, whether you have any immunity whatsoever.
Yes, that's absolutely right, Karen. Good morning to you. I mean, it feels as though there isn't going to be a sector of the population that isn't hit in some way, shape or form by the announcements that we're going to get from Rachel Reeves in just a few hours' time. Now, that's not to say there won't be some people who will actually emerge better off from this budget. I'm speaking specifically about families who have more than 2 children, because there's a cap in place at the moment on child benefit. It's only paid out to the first 2 children in every family. And we know that Rachel Reeves is likely to lift that cap away. Very, very popular with her own backbench MPs. It's a giveaway that will cost the Chancellor something like £3.25 billion. But there are literally hundreds of thousands of families up and down the UK that will be better off, to the tune of several £1,000s each as a result of that measure. So not everyone is going to be worse off. Other giveaways potentially. We think that the Chancellor is going to keep in place the 5p freeze on fuel duty that was introduced by Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor back in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. Hard to see the justification for that given the way that wholesale energy prices have subsequently fallen, but it's a brave Chancellor that takes on the motoring lobby in this country. And indeed fuel duties, the underlying level of fuel duty has been frozen since George Osborne became Chancellor back in 2010. No Chancellor has dared tamper with that since, at a cumulative cost to the UK Treasury of something like £100 billion over those 15 years. We're also expecting measures on household energy bills as well. A big Labour promise when it came to power, they'd take energy bills down by £300. That hasn't happened so far. So we think that some of the environmental levies that are put on household bills are actually going to be absorbed back into general taxation. So these are real efforts by the Chancellor to try and address the cost of living across the UK. But as you say, there are going to be an awful lot of painful measures for other people as well. The big ticket item, as you mentioned, Karen, we're likely to see a freezing in tax thresholds, income tax. That will raise something like £8 billion, but it means essentially more and more people risk being dragged into higher tax brackets. And ultimately, that is a fiscal drag. That is going to hit a lot of people directly in the pocket. And then there's going to be what's been referred to as a smorgasbord of tax increases, individual measures, raising small sums of money. We're likely to get, for example, as we were discussing yesterday, an increase in the cost of milkshakes, believe it or not, and lattes, because the Chancellor apparently is going to drag those into the purview of the sugar tax, which is whereby fizzy drinks with more than 5 milligrams per 100 grams of sugar per 100 millilitres, there's tax payable on that, and we think that that is going to be dragging milkshakes into it. Small measure, only raises about 50 million quid, but it's going to annoy a lot of people in the process.
Doesn't look like this is going to be a very sweet budget then to some people. Ian, stay with us. Thank you so much. We'll be seeing a lot more from you throughout the day, but stay with us for this conversation because I want to bring in Raul Ruparel, director of Boston Consulting Group's Center for Growth. He's also former special advisor to Prime Minister Theresa May. Raul, thank you so much for your time this morning. This is a make or break budget for the Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is about developing a convincing story for the economy, as you point out in your notes here. How can she do that?
Well, look, I think she needs to meet and appease a few audiences in this budget. Obviously, we have heard and you've been talking about the need to make sure that she doesn't rattle markets and that they are reassured about the fiscal path and the consolidation that she's going to set out in this budget. So that's the first audience, I think, and that kind of stability is something they've been searching for. And I think, obviously, the level of uncertainty and speculation we've heard over the past few weeks and months has not helped things. But then I think from a business perspective, they do feel less in the crosshairs in this budget than they did, say, this time last year, where they knew that they were going to be hit a bit harder by things like the employer NICs rise. But I think they also feel there isn't going to be a huge amount for them in this budget. And I think that is where they will really be watching what the Chancellor says in terms of what is the growth narrative that she is going to set out? Where does she believe the drivers of growth going to come from? And what is their focus? And I think, we've heard a lot about growth being the core mission of this government over the past few months or year. Yet in recent communication, when you look at what the Chancellor is talking about, she's focused on the cost of living, on NHS and the debt level. And so I think the concern from business is that growth is falling back as a priority. So I think this budget and her speech in particular, just in terms of setting out that narrative, is an opportunity to reinforce the commitment to that and the key levers, whether that's capital investment, whether that's deregulation and improving the business environment. I think they want to hear and see what steps are going to be taken there.
Raul, just on that point, what is the pathway to growth? And you've been doing a lot of work on that. Give us some concrete steps. I know every successive UK government has been trying to find that magic formula. What could it be?
Well, look, I think there's a few key pillars we talk about. So one is investment. The UK has underinvested in infrastructure, in capital and in intangible for, a number of decades. So I think unlocking that is quite important. How do you do that? Well, we do see that the government is committing more money to capital investment, which is positive, and it looks like the Chancellor is going to protect that today. But I think we also need to try and unlock more business investment. And I think that fundamentally comes down to improving the business environment in this country. At the moment, input costs are simply too high high and the returns on investment aren't what we'd like to see. And so that means bringing down and trying to bear down on energy costs, on regulatory costs, on improving kind of labour flexibility and making it easier to find the right skilled workers in the UK. So that's one pillar. Obviously, productivity and diffusion of best practice is another one. The UK has some of the best and world-class firms and the most innovative firms, but we also have a long tail of less productive firms. So how can we try and push and spread best practice throughout the economy? So those are a couple of things. And then obviously we know the industrial strategy has been set out and the focus on some high growth sectors, but I think we really need to think about where are our strengths and how can we double down on those. And that's particularly in the services sector, in services exports, and how do we ensure that those are the key focus and are supported in the right way.
Raoul, what about the banks in particular? I mean, there was a lot of pressure on Rachel Reeves from her own backbenchers to increase the amount of taxes paid by the banks, which the banks obviously in turn said, well, if you do that to us, we won't be able to lend us much. It looks as though they might have had a bit of a result here.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at the banks in particular, they have returned to profitability and their margins are improving. So that has renewed the focus, as you say, in terms of potentially increasing tax on them. But I think when you look at the underlying story, how have they returned to profit and improved their margins? It's really been driven by higher interest rates and ability to push that interest rate margin. Now, from a personal perspective, I'm not sure how sustainable that's going to be in the long term. Obviously, rates are going to start coming down, and whether you can continue to push that margin increase in a competitive market is tricky. And so I think when you look at the state of UK banks, while it may look like it's improving, the ability of them to generate income beyond just higher interest rates has been quite limited, and particularly when you look compared to peers in France or the US. So I can see why there was some temptation to look at the banks, but when you look at the actual position in terms of how they're generating that improved margin, it doesn't actually look that positive, and therefore I think it's probably right that they've been spared, a tax increase in this budget, or likely to be spared from what we've heard. And so I can see, I think in that situation, it's the right call. And as you say, ultimately, we want to get the banks lending and getting more money into the economy. And that's something they've really struggled with. And there is a review obviously going on of capital requirements and whether that can unlock some more lending into the economy. So I think it's the right message to send at this point in time, not to increase tax on the banks and focus on how can we get them lending to both businesses and consumers.
It's Karen jumping in. One of the challenges of this budget has been setting out the priorities and then working out which mechanism to pull to try and address some of those priorities. We mentioned that on the eve of the budget, we've had this change to the minimum wage, effectively going up by 4.1%. The Chancellor, no doubt concerned about the rise in unemployment, youth unemployment. But is it the right mechanism to tackle using the minimum wage when the reality is we know that the minimum wage has gone up so much that it's very much akin to almost the entry-level graduate positions, challenging whether people actually want to go to universities and take up some of those graduate positions. So is this the wrong mechanism? Will it just fuel inflation, or will it bring some benefits to the economy?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Look, I think we are getting to a stage where the minimum wage and national living wage is 60% or more of the median income, and that does, I think, start to create challenges in terms of whether there is an attractive enough environment and whether the cost of employing people at this level is too high. And I think when you look at what else is going on in the labour market, in the sense that the labour market is easing, we know that from a tight place, but it is easing. We know that the cost of employers in terms of the NICS rise, in terms of the Employment Rights Bill, are also going to be increasing their costs. And so I think at this time to be pushing that cost onto employers doesn't feel like the right call in terms of the labour market we're trying to build and the environment we need. And then I think if you look at why young people aren't in work, obviously a lot of them, it's not just that they're unemployed, it's that they're out of the labour force entirely for health reasons, for other reasons. And so I think trying to tackle that underlying challenge is actually more important than just pushing slightly higher wages. I think a lot of the motivation on the wage side is probably tied to the kind of wider benefits picture. And obviously we are likely to see the change in two-child benefit cap. We know that the benefit environment and spending on benefits is improving, and so is increasing. And so I think there is a desire to try to improve the incentives for work. but I'm not sure that this is quite the right way to do it when you look at the underlying reasons in terms of health, in terms of lack of mobility or opportunity within parts of the labour force. I'm not sure this is the right way to tackle that, given the underlying problems that are causing young people to be out of work.
Raoul, you've put your finger on a very crucial point there, which is that the vast majority of the fiscal consolidation Rachel Reeves has undertaken, both in the budget last year and what we expect to hear today, has largely been on the tax side rather than on the spending side. Is that just a consequence of her being boxed in by her own Labour backbenchers?
Yeah, look, I think it is. It is partly the sense that, we saw with the welfare reforms earlier this year, even pushing 5 billion, 6 billion of savings proved to be particularly controversial and particularly difficult to get through. I mean, I sympathise, obviously, having worked in government, pushing spending cuts is always challenging and difficult. But I do think, there are a number of areas where they found it quite challenging to try and push through for political reasons. And given that they have got a less certain position or a less strong position with their backbenchers than obviously a year ago. The other side of it, though, is of course that in many ways tax raising measures are more certain, particularly when it comes to the OBR and the way the OBR scores things and the credit they would get in terms of the fiscal position. A tax rise is generally clearer, easier to understand, and will be given the full kind of credit in terms of the spending in increased income and therefore the improved fiscal position. I think a lot of the spending cuts, are quite reliant on people's responses. So you take the welfare reforms, for example. I know there is an ongoing discussion with the OBR and has been for some time around the impacts of certain welfare reforms on getting people back into the labour force. And I think this is quite a unique problem, particularly given long-term sickness and people out of the labour force. And there aren't many examples globally of how effective these policies have been, or historically whether these policies have actually worked to get people back into the labour force. So the OBR is notably sceptical about whether that will generate the savings the government suggests. And so I think it's not just the politics of this. There is an element of, given the way we've set up the fiscal rules, given the system we have, what will generate the kind of savings and improve the fiscal picture, on paper, unfortunately. And I don't think it's a particularly positive way to look at things, but what is improving on paper and what can give them the fiscal room and fiscal certainty they need. And so it's a combination of those factors that I think has led her and the government to lean more heavily on tax at this point in time than spending.
Raoul, thank you so much for your perspective this morning. Appreciate it. Raoul Parel, Director of Boston Consulting Group Center for Growth and former Special Advisor to Prime Minister Theresa May. And you can watch the budget in full from 12:30 London time on the CNBC International Live YouTube page. Make sure you don't miss that. Still coming up on the show, Google gains an upper hand in the AI race, taking the competition to NVIDIA as the battle for chip dominance heats up. We're live on the ground from the Adopt AI Summit in Paris next. Plus, the final five, President Trump contemplates making his Fed chair appointment before Christmas, as prediction markets place Kevin Hassett as the frontrunner to take over from Jerome Powell. And of course, if you haven't noticed, it is budget day in the UK. Chancellor Rachel Reeves prepares to unveil her plans later today. Deputy Leader and Reform MP Richard Tice will be joining us to discuss. That's coming up at 8:45 London time. We'll be back in 2.
Executive Decisions is the new podcast from CNBC, where I ask powerful leaders about their decisions that changed everything. I'm Steve Sedgwick. Here's the CEO of the London Stock Exchange Group, Julia Hoggett.
There is no justification whatsoever for not doing the right thing, even if the right thing is hard to do. Which also means that if the context changes or the information changes, it is absolutely fine to also change your mind.
That's Executive Decisions with me, Steve Sedgwick. Get it wherever you're listening to this.
to show you what happened in the U.S. markets overnight, and we saw stocks rising for a third consecutive session. Take a look at this. The Dow up by 1.4%, the S&P up by 1.9%, and the Nasdaq rising 0.7%. A lot of factors at play here. Of course, we got retail sales number and consumer confidence numbers that were weaker than expected. Once again, elevating expectations and hopes that we are going to be seeing that Fed rate cut in the month of December. CME futures now pricing in an 80% chance of that actually happening. Also want to draw your attention to what happened in tech stocks, because the AI race and the competition amongst Alphabet and, of course, NVIDIA is increasing. NVIDIA down by 2.6% in yesterday's trading session. Alphabet up by 1.5%. Meta up almost 4%. This is as reports were out that Meta is in discussions to use Google's AI chips in its data centers from 2027 and rent chips from Google Cloud by next year. Now, let's take a quick check of Asian markets as well. Interesting session that's playing out there as well. On the back of those hopes for Fed easing in the month of December, the Nikkei 225 up by 1.8%. The Hang Seng also joining the rally, albeit to a lesser extent, up by 0.3%. The Shanghai Comp slightly underwater. When it comes to European futures, this is the picture. We are expecting some modest gains at the start of the trading session. The FTSE 100 seen up by 0.3%. Crucial day, of course, for the FTSE, given that it's UK budget day. The CAC 40 seen up by 0.6%. The DAX seen higher by 0.7%. Stock 600 closing up by 0.9% in yesterday's trading session. The DAX gaining more than 1%. Also worth noting, Karen, that the defense sector actually rebounded after 2 days of very heavy selling. It was down by 5% over 2 consecutive trading days on the prospect of peace in the Ukraine.
Caroline, you were just mentioning the story that we've been following very closely out of Silicon Valley around the AI story. And Adopt AI has kicked off in Paris with C-suite executives gathering to discuss specific use cases for the new technology. Speaking at the event, French President Emmanuel Macron urged industries to close agreements with European tech startups before considering their overseas counterparts.
What we want to defend as an agenda at the European scale is an EU preference. In China, you have a Chinese exclusivity. In the US, you have a US preference. The European Union is the only place in the world where you have a non-European preference de facto. And this is super important for the governments, but as well for the large corporates. When there is an existing competitive European solution, please adopt it. And make it clear for us as policymakers in our rules that we have to prefer European solutions. It's not a protectionist approach, but this is the only way to develop our own ecosystem and to remain sovereign. Because if all the others adopt a regional or a national preference, they arrive after having secured their domestic market and they conquer the European market. So we have to stop being naive.
And let's get out to Charlotte. She's at Adopt AI. Charlotte, the president talking very passionately on stage there about homegrown talent. He does turn up to all the major technology events in France, showing just how committed he is to ensuring that France is part of the AI build-out.
Yes, and you have to give it to him. President Macron has been talking about strategic autonomy and sovereignty for a very long time, before the pandemic, before, the second Trump administration, before all this time. And, he's proved to be right. And now he's brought on board more of his European partners. We heard last week when he was meeting with Chancellor Merz of Germany as well, aligning on the vision that, Europeans need to be less naive and try to build their own ecosystem. It's difficult because they had a late start and they still rely on many big American tech giants. But, they want to build their own companies. Of course, we know Mistral AI is kind of the poster child of the success here in France. And now you have this Adopt AI conference when it's, about AI and the competitive edge that it can give an economy. And so it's about other companies to try to adopt the technology in order to not lose an edge. And so it's interesting to hear from all these companies, including Sanofi, the pharma giant. Here I had a chance to catch up with Paul Hudson. We know the pharma industry is one that is kind of benefiting the most from the AI revolution because, it relies on data. And so a way to deal with data is really helpful. So when I spoke to him, we talked about all of aspects, how it's changing the manufacturing, how it's changing research. And he said that population health management is becoming a very big deal in terms of economic prosperity.
Medicines, vaccines, for example, protect so many people, give people normal lives, give people a better quality of life or extend life. I think what we're going to find in this fourth industrial revolution is more specific medicines, more efficacious, perhaps even safer, things that we've never been able to do before, drug the undruggable disease. I think for governments, it's quite interesting. Post-COVID, with the fiscal pressure and the budget deficits, governments are looking for the best intervention that they can deploy to get people back to work. They want people back to work. In the UK, there are 3 million people who don't work because the government won't give them the medicine that would make them better and they could go back to work. Now, that's the Ministry of Health. The Ministry of Finance is saying, please go back to work. We need to contribute to GDP because things are tough. Those moments are coming. Population health management is becoming a very big deal in terms of economic prosperity and what that means for quality of your life and duration of life. So this is the most exciting time that I've ever known in my 35 years. It's a real privilege. And if you're deciding whether to adopt AI, it's already too late.
Now, that was Paul Hudson, the CEO of Sanofi. And look, a lot of the conversation here is about, of course, the energy needs for that AI transition and revolution. And we know that data centers use a lot of energy, so it's trying to make this efficient. And in terms of data center build, where Europe is a little bit behind, about 50% of all data centers in the world are in the US, 25% is in EMEA, and France is quite behind the UK or Germany. But look, France is pitching itself as a good place for data centers. They have low carbon, cheap energy because thanks to nuclear. So that's one of the pitch that we heard from President Macron yesterday. But it was interesting to hear from the company Legrand. It's a 150-year-old company, and yet they have been very much at the heart of the trade, the AI trade at the moment, as reflected in their shares as well. They were up around 60% in October at the peak. They're a little bit lower now year to date, but certainly, they are part of that AI trade because they provide some solutions for better energy consumption and making more efficient for data centers, so they have been benefiting from this. And he said, look, Europe is a little bit behind, but they still have a role to play, and there's some issues that they all have to resolve.
Of course, we will love Europe to grow faster, and it will come because it has become a sovereignty issue, so every single country wants to have its own network of data centers. But whether in Europe, in the US, in China or elsewhere, the energy dilemma remains. And I think it must be a common target of the whole industry to reduce what we call the power usage, to improve the power usage effectiveness, so to make sure that data centers are more and more efficient when it comes actually not only to energy, but also when it comes to water consumption or the use of contracting capabilities. And this is a topic which is shared on both sides of the Atlantic.
That was Benoît Coquard, the CEO of Legrand, saying, the energy dilemma remains, but there are certainly players in providing some solution and making the energy reliable and cheaper, ways to cool data centers better. And again, that has been reflected in their share price this year. They're up around 38% year to date. They were up 60% back in October before the AI trade kind of slowed down and because of the fears around and the AI bubble. But certainly really interesting to hear on, the pitch from France saying, look, we have cheap energy. We have low carbon energy as well. There is nuclear. We export energy. We could use some of that energy instead of exporting it for data centers. That's very much the pitch that we hear. And I actually will speak very shortly with the CEO of EDF here in a fireside. And that's very much the message that he's had, that he will be having here at this conference.